what is the role of artificial intelligence, in helping authors. That's a real important area in moving forward. I'm looking forward to helping PTJ figure this out so that we handle it in a way that meets the goals of the members and the association and keeps us, positioned in a way where people view us as a trustworthy source of information.
All right. Well, welcome to the Hands-On, Hands-Off podcast through the AOMT. And I'm excited today because I get the honor to host and have a conversation with Steve George. I've known Steve for actually a little while, oddly enough, not so much in the professional ranks, but more as a former neighbor of mine. And so, but I had a really, a lot of respect for him and all the things that he's been able to do for our profession. And really, I think this will be a good podcast today, especially because of Steve's recent transition to the role of PTJ editor-in-chief. And I think a lot of our listeners are going to have an interest in this area, especially with regards to the whole process of publication and things of that nature. And to get into Steve's, his head a little bit about what all is entailed, I think is going to be wonderful, especially because Steve obviously has had quite a journey to get himself to this point where he is actually at. So with all that being said, I'm going to welcome Steve into the show here.
Thanks.
Good afternoon, Steve. How are you doing?
Good. Good to see you.
Good.
Former neighbor.
Yeah. I don't think you chased me out. I think I chased my own self out. Certainly miss the neighborhood a lot. And as I told you once before, I miss sometimes the random bumps into you and having some nice little side conversations that didn't always actually go about physical therapy, which is actually kind of cool. Maybe I have a little bit of a unique honor of having that kind of relationship with you. It tends to be a little bit more like football and other junk.
Right. Yeah. Much more interest in Montana and West Virginia football, respectively, because of those. And, I think the realization that both of our children were, outside a lot, seeing each other running, and that kind of funny, our kids saying, boy, those Cooley kids run a lot, and your kids saying, boy, those George kids are out there shooting baskets a lot. Realized that both of them were out there a lot doing their activities that they like. So good to see you, and greetings from Churton Grove.
There we go. Well, greetings from all the way over here on the east side, Raleigh. All right. So I'm going to get right into this, actually, because I know that we, our listeners are going to want to hear a little bit to this, and I'm waiting for you to throw in a little West Virginia football, but we're going to maybe get into that here in a moment. I kind of did already, but so obviously I think, a lot of our listeners probably know at least who you are in terms of name and things of that nature, and what you've done for publications and research and influence, and especially musculoskeletal practice. But can you tell our listeners a little bit about your background, and more importantly, how all of that evolved to you becoming the editor-in-chief of PTJ?
Yeah, sure. I can give kind of the streamlined version, and then if something catches your ear, we can dive in and look at some of the subfolders. But I mean, I think like a lot of people in my era, trained at a bachelor's level. So my full intent was to be a practicing physical therapist. And I practiced full time for 7 years in the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center system. Moved from inpatient to outpatient. At the time, you could, but it wasn't common to go right into outpatient. There was a preference, at least at UPMC, to spending some time in inpatient and kind of getting exposure that way and some experience and seasoning. And then eventually I was spending most of my time. I worked at the sports medicine clinic when it was in Baum Boulevard. It was predates the fancy one they show now whenever the Steelers or the Pitt Panthers are on, the one in the South Side. This was a smaller clinic, but very influential, some great surgeons there, and some great PTs. So it was a really, I guess, robust clinical environment to grow up in, and started to get interested in some research questions. And at the time, was going to the literature and started to get frustrated that some of the things I was interested in, you really couldn't find in the literature. And then there were some good folks at Pitt who ended up being my mentors, who suggested that maybe I need to do research training and learn how to answer those questions. And I'm always grateful that they suggested that, because I really didn't have that mindset at the time that I could train and actually answer these questions instead of waiting around for someone to do a study on what I was interested in. And that was people like Julie Fritz and Tony DeLito that were kind of pushing me in that direction. And at really, unbeknownst to me at the time, that was kind of a leaping off point where my career was moving from a clinical focus to an academic focus. So I did the research training and decided to go all in on that, and ended up down at the University of Florida right around the same time. There was a lot of interest in pain research, and I did a postdoc in pain research and rehabilitation outcomes, and started that in 2002. And there were not a lot of people who thought at that point doing a postdoc in pain research was a brilliant idea. I mean, I was intellectually interested in the topic because I thought it outpatient working clinically, especially with the knowledge base we had then, it was very hard to predict who was going to do well and who wasn't going to do well, especially with pain reports. And what I had learned was a very biomedical orientation, and there was starting to be some measurement tools were starting to come to the surface, and none of them, were related to things that we had been trained on as PTs. So I was, a lot of where you end up is the realm and the time era that you were in. And I was really in a good era for PTs becoming interested in pain research. And for me, that meant getting some expertise in psychological influences and seeing whether or not that has clinical relevance. And, fortunately for me, it did. It did have clinical relevance, and that served as my research focus. And that led, I think the pain research realm led to some dedicated studies in manual therapy. We had some early PhD students that were heavy into manual therapy and were fellows. So that led to studying some of the kind of more of a mechanistic look at manual therapy, because we did have collaborators that were interested in pain processing and really being able to map how manual therapy may operate on a updated understanding of pain was a very fruitful exercise. Joel Bialowski kind of led the charge with that, and he was my first PhD student at Florida. And as best I can tell, there's still interest in, some of that early conceptual model work, and the data still supports, that there are some neurophysiologic effects, and it's more than just the movement of the joint and how hard, how fast, and what direction you push it in. So, so fast forward, I'm getting well adept and building a research career, and I had started my relationship with PTJ as an author and moved into a reviewer, and then the editor-in-chief at the time, Beck Craig, kind of pushed me and a few others who had just become editorial board members to take a more rigorous look at randomized clinical trials. So I worked with some international members with that, and we ended up being very prolific researchers: Chris Mayer, Rachel Bookbinder, and Chris Main. And they also just happened to be people that were going to publish some really landmark trials over the next 10 or 15 years, and being able to work directly with them. And that was the first kind of hint I got of leadership at a journal level, was through that experiences with Beck, charging me to work with this, at the time, and they still are, much more accomplished group of clinical trialists than I was. But because I was on the US representative, ended up being kind of the key communicator and helping that team move along. Certainly was not the most talented person, but I was in the States. I had direct linkage to the journal. And so from that, it just kind of evolved to more leadership opportunities with the journal, and frankly, just caring that the journal does well. So when the opportunity came up to interview, and be in the editor-in-chief discussion, I think there was some strategy involved, but a lot of it was just being active in the game. And when I say the game of, having my own research program, understanding publications and what makes a strong publication and what makes maybe a less strong publication. And also just having an interest in leadership at the level of a journal. This journal was near and dear to my heart because it's, it's the leading journal of our association. And also I had invested a lot of my time in it. So when the opportunity came, at that point I was deputy editor. It was, for me, it was kind of a go, no go moment. If the journal was happy with some of the direct, or if the board and, the selection committee were happy with some of the direction of the journal, then a candidate like myself was going to be potentially a strong candidate. But if they wanted fresh ideas and new blood, then I wasn't going to be as attractive. And it's kind of nice to be at that point in your career where if it worked out, great. And if it didn't, I would understand too. I'm not, but fortunately, the choice went in my direction, and, I've been in that role since January now.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, that's so so what you're saying is that you didn't in kindergarten when your teachers asked what do you want to do when you become when you grow up, you didn't say I want to be an editor in chief of a scientific journal is what
That
you
is,
basically just
yeah,
said.
yeah. And in fact, there's certain places along my educational journey where if I had been randomly programmed to say that, some of my teachers, especially English teachers, would have, their heads may have exploded. So
I
now it's
was
pretty
actually
locked
gonna
in, pretty locked
ask
in
you
to
this,
baseball, at kindergarten
right?
through, 10th, 11th grade. So
I was actually going to ask you this question later on, but I'm going to ask it now because I think it just makes more sense to do this. What is because I think a lot of people have this perception of what a what a scientific journal editor is like. What are some before we get into like some of the things that you do? What are some misperceptions of a editor in chief of a a very well respected journal?
right. I haven't seen a lot of pipes or tweed jackets in
That's
the
what I was
editors
thinking.
that I bump into. My dog does not bring me the newspaper rolled up. Even if it was delivered to our driveway, I'm dating myself because I can remember when newspapers, were in every driveway. I think editors, especially, I mean, there's different journals, right? But so the editors that I talk to about this role, and then frankly other journals that I would have been interested in leading this, I don't want people to think that this, there are other opportunities, but it takes a lot of time and energy. So I was selective in the type of journal that I wanted, to be the editor in chief. And I do think it's people that have been engaged and very interest. I do think they have to have their own level of success. It doesn't have to be, I don't think it's a set number of publications, but I think it has to be a level of success where they're comfortable with what they know really well, and they're equally comfortable knowing where I need to get other experts around the table to help me make decisions. And then I think, and it may just be of who I talk to, most of the editors are level-headed and fair-minded, and they really want what is best for the journal, which unfortunately means saying no. We don't
Mhm.
think this manuscript fits in our journal, but
Mhm.
maybe making sure the way you say that and how you say that, and that, respecting the process, makes that pill a little easier to swallow. But, I certainly don't expect anyone to be happy that a journal, or PTJ in particular, has rejected their paper. But I certainly hope, they think they went through the same process that everyone else did, and that, there was a reason. You don't have to agree with the reason. In fact, the author should probably be the strongest advocate for the paper, because
Mhm.
other people aren't going to advocate for your work. But I think that's the type of thing I think of the editor, where it's a little less, well, because I said so, and a little
Yep.
more, we have a process. Your paper went through the process. I don't want to get in the middle of all of the process all the time. There are rare times I need to insert myself, but I trust in the process. I trust in our editorial board. I trust in our reviewers. And does that mean we get it wrong every time? Of course not. But do we get it wrong enough that we can be trusted? Yes. That's what I am aiming for. And that's that's what I think, is the other characteristic of, when you say what an editor is. It's a great question, because I do think some of the cartoon images that pop in don't match not just myself, but other editors that I've spoken to about their role, and what do they think about as being an editor in chief. Most of them are pretty reasonable people, very pragmatic, but they do want to maintain standards, and they do believe in the process of peer review.
Well, I think one of the things that you mentioned was interesting to me, and just before we got onto this podcast, I was doing a little bit of research about, an editor in chief, because I had before this the tweed jacket and the pipe in my head, and maybe a red pen, a lot of red pens on your desk or something, and favorable to that. But I mean, honestly, when I started looking at it, a lot of the traits and characteristics of a editor in chief, and you mentioned this because it's more of also a leadership position. So a lot of it is not just sitting down and reading 100 papers or whatever it is. It's sort of taking the journal and ultimately taking what is science, and trying to figure out how that all gets disseminated and distributed, and so on and so forth. So it was pretty interesting to me how much the editor in chief position probably is very different. And so to that end, like what does a day in of the life of a editor in chief sort of look like? And I know that you wear numerous hats, so it's not just that hat
Yeah.
only. But when you
Well,
have
you
that
said
hat on, what's it like?
Yeah, when you said we were going to be on video, I took it as a cue. You didn't want me to wear any hat, so that's why I'm not literally wearing a hat today, because you know
You
what
could have
what
worn a
hat.
hat. No, it
Yeah,
just
you know what hat it
really.
would be. But I think one of the things, and first of all, it definitely disrupted my prior workflow. So 8 months into this, I almost 9 months, starting the ninth month, I think, beginning to understand that there are some things that I can regiment and make routine, but ultimately there needs to be room for flexibility, because um, there are things that come to the surface that someone may want the opinion of, my opinion on. And that could be a reviewer, that could be an editorial board member, that could be our managing editor, that could be one of those authors that I told you about who's not super happy about the decision. And finding what is the right level of response time for that, because I can't react to each of those as they happen. Otherwise, that's all I'd be doing. But I can't let it go too long either, because then people will think, he's asleep at the wheel. So there are times I've struck that balance well. And then there's times when it's like, oh, I wanted to respond to this email a week ago, and I'm just now getting around to it because of the inbox. So I think, the things you can regiment, though, are making sure staying up to date on manuscript decisions. So I try to bunch those. I try to spend 1 or 2 days moving through those, so that they don't sneak up on me. And then there are a fair number of meetings that like you said, I represent the journal, but because the journal represents the association, there are some meetings that I maybe will get pulled into as in my role, mostly related to the journal, but sometimes they try to keep the editor in chief role around the scientific mission, but there are operational things that interact with the scientific mission that I need to be aware of and maybe provide input on. So, I think it's a little bit of one of those. Maybe it's a little bit of a, back to your clinical roots, where you start off and you maybe have your nice schedule, and then there's a few cancellations, there's an add-on, somebody's 40 minutes early, another person's 40 minutes late. Having that kind of thought of it, of, I'm going to have a clinic day today, and I'm just going to, part of it is I can anticipate what's going to happen, and the other part is I have to be flexible enough to be able to change in midstream. And then, just like the clinical example, not getting too thrown off your game if it's not going the way you want it, and not taking it out on people that are trying to help you or coming to you, and also not celebrating too much when you think you got it completely under control. So, you know, and there are days I am deathly afraid of my email inbox. For those of you that are listening, that are emailing me and saying he hasn't got back to me and it's 3 weeks. There are some days that I just am a little flabbergasted and about the inbox. So that, that is the part I think that remains a challenge is, how do you manage that with also meeting with people, spending the time to give that paper that is coming to you for a decision the time it needs to make sure that, hey, yeah, I'm going to stand behind this decision. That isn't always aligned with answering, 30 emails a day.
You may actually provide a class to some individuals on how to manage an Outlook inbox system.
It's right.
So
Well,
I think a lot of us need a little work on that as well too. Um, so the so I know that we have a lot of listeners on that have a lot of variability and experience with regards to research, either being researchers or kind of like you were early in your clinic days, and all of us are in our clinic days where we're consumers of research. And so I'd really love, I think our listeners would like to hear, I think, a little bit about, obviously you've got editorial experience with other journals, but maybe specifically with PTJ and then other journals as well. But like, what is the process that happens in your role, and when somebody hits the submit, and then it goes from submission to publication? Especially because we hear, like, obviously some journals are really really good and really efficient and getting that process done. I review for journals and such, and so it's, I know a lot of it is dependent upon the activity of the reviewers and such. But going from submission, all the way to that process of publication, what can you describe to our listeners what all that is about?
yeah, I think, and there is some variation in this journal to journal. There's some key decisions, but it seems to make sense. I'll describe more or less faithfully what we do with PTJ, and so you hit submit, and you're happy because you entered all the, the metadata that you had to, including everyone's email address. But, I'm still a little curious why we have to enter all that stuff, but that's for a different, podcast. And then, there usually is a quality check to make sure you're adhering to the big picture things in the author guidelines. So in PTJ, that's word count, and did you submit it for the right article category? We're not looking to be super stringent at this point, but if someone submits a manuscript with 8,000 words and our word limit is 4,000, we don't want to burden our reviewers with feeling like they need to go through that. It's a little different story if someone submits a paper with 4,300 words. Maybe that one is, we'll move it on. But if it's a blatant, or if someone submits a case report, but they submit it as a randomized trial, we're going to go back to the authors on that. So once it moves from there, most journals, and PTJ is one, there is a screening process by the editorial board, which essentially takes a quick look at the paper and decides, is this something we want to send out for a review? And it's not a full review. Sometimes these are called desk rejects, immediate rejects. But the main intent of that is I think two things. One, it is sometimes relatively easy to determine if a paper just has a major fatal flaw or just doesn't align with the journal's mission. And then the other, I'm blanking on what the other is, and I'll come back to the other is, we can't overburden our reviewer pool with sending everything out for review. One of the things I think of conceptually is one of our most valuable commodities is reviewer time, because it's volunteer and it is something that, we need to respect, because the strength of it being volunteer is theoretically, that should limit some of the conflicts and things like that, because someone is doing this on their own volition. They're taking a look at it. But the downside of that is it competes with all their other professional responsibilities. So we want to value that time. And the article screen is a good way to do that. Some journals, including PTJ, screen out a fair amount. Like, I think, as the editor-in-chief, I think of this between 2/3 and 3 out of 4 are articles that, we are electing not to send out for review. So that could be the ending point, and it may be the ending point. And I just told you at PTJ, it is the ending point for the majority of articles that are submitted. If it goes past that, then it is sent for review. We try to have the editorial board member who screened it also be the person who's in charge. Now it'll go out to reviewers, and the review process kicks in. We try to invite two. Sometimes we'll invite more if certain expertise is needed, like a statistical. And that is really the area that is beyond our control for how long that takes. But let's say, most reviewers are pretty good at this, by the way. Let's say they get it in 2 or 3 weeks, all the reviewers are there. Then that information goes to the board member who looks at it, synthesizes, and makes a recommendation for the decision. At that point, I become relevant. You can hear how long I've been irrelevant in this process, because now the decision from the editorial board member comes as a recommendation. And at PTJ, classically, that went to the editor-in-chief or the deputy editor. I've requested, and we have a structure now where there are associate editors. So the recommendation will go to the associate editors. In the not too distant future, the associate editors will be decision editors, so they can make a final decision. That will allow us to be more, rapid with making decisions. But now they come to me. I read, and what I look for are, there are some manuscripts where there's high agreement from the reviewer to the editorial board member. That is a nice day. Where I look in a little bit more is if there's some, divergence of opinions. Reviewer 1 loves it, reviewer 2 hates it. The editorial board member is kind of, seeing both sides. Where do I get involved? So then that's the decision. Then the decision goes out. And most journals, and PTJ is one of them, the editor-in-chief has that, it's like the executive branch. That is my call. So there could be a manuscript that looks very favorably reviewed, but when I look at it from my lens, I'm not as excited about it. And it is my call. It could be the other way around. There could be some concerns with it, but maybe it's an area that I'm interested in or we want to grow. And, that's where there's a little bit of, I don't want to call it leeway, but a little bit of judgment at the editor-in-chief level. And then it goes back to the authors. And if it's an opportunity to revise it, we start that process again, except it doesn't get screened. It just goes back out for review if it's a revision. But if it's rejected at that point, then, that's the end for that path for those journals. So of the 25% that we send out, we still reject about 40% of them. And I don't know if these numbers are good or bad. I just know we get 900-ish submissions. And, there's only so much room for what we can publish. And we have certain, standards that we want to maintain for PTJ. And that's what we try to do.
900 submissions. And what's that time frame?
In about a year. In a year.
In a year. Okay. Yeah. That's a lot. Yeah, that's it's actually impressive. It's really kind of good news that there's so many people doing research out there. And it's interesting too, because there's a lot of journals now compared to 2002
Right.
for
Yeah.
homes for publication. So obviously the research has intensified, at least in terms of volume. And then, obviously the role of you all is to identify whether that's the type of quality and aligns with the values and the missions and such of the journal. I'm curious, you mentioned that the biggest asset to a journal is the reviewers. And I actually appreciate that a lot because I do review a fair amount. And I know that that's, it's not necessarily a thankless position. I think the way I've got to look at it is that I'm getting early access to some of the information that is being put out there, which is a really cool opportunity, but does take time. But I know that that's that's how you really got involved. I mean, obviously you submitted, a paper early on in your research career, and then you get kind of tagged to do reviewing and such. What is the process for you all in identifying reviewers, and what is there a process for our listeners if they are interested in becoming a reviewer? I know that you probably can't have too many hands on deck, but you also probably have some, certain requirements and things of
Yeah.
that nature. But
I mean, it's a really good question. I appreciate the chance, to advocate for reviewers in general and people that are interested. I will back up just a second and let you know that one of the hardest decisions about being editor in chief was realizing I wasn't going to be reviewing for other journals moving forward.
mm, that's
Because I've
interesting.
always done that. Even when I was deputy editor, I always reviewed for certain journals because
Hmm.
partly what you talked about, Derek, the early access, it is cool to see stuff that is going to make a splash well before it's published. Obviously, you can't move on it, but you've seen it and you know what
Hmm.
it's going to have. So this will be the first time in my career. So I don't just say that. I mean, I actively participated as a reviewer. I had a little bit of a karmic equation where I felt like I should, anytime I had something in review, I should review something. So anytime we had a paper, it didn't have to be at the same journal, but maybe this is too much inside information but I did feel a responsibility that if I was burdening the system, I had to unweight it. And this is the first time in my career, I actually talked to Jan Reynolds, the managing editor. I was like, "Can I review?" And she basically said, It's not that we can prevent you but it just might not be a great look to know that the editor in chief is reviewing. So I get it.
Right.
So that's my plug. But if people are interested in reviewing for any journal, but PTJ, step one is emailing someone. It can be me, it can be Jan, the managing editor that you're interested in, and we can add you to our reviewer pool. We have, obviously, if you reviewed in the past, that's a good start, and maybe we're more likely to assign you a paper right away to see how you do. But even if you haven't, and you but someone who could help you the first time, let us know that, because we do track who reviews in a timely and they're helpful, and we do track who is less helpful, and that influences who we send that out. We want to keep that expanding, because that becomes a bit of an abusive system when you keep asking the people who are
Hmm.
timely to do it. So we don't want to overburden the people that do a good job, because it is volunteer. And the only way you can do that really is to keep your pool expanding and see who performs as a reviewer, because it is a little bit of an interesting role, because I think by design it should be a little bit thankless, because you want to remain anonymous,
Hmm.
because the best review sometimes is, I feel like the best review is either anonymous or everyone knows who they are and we're just going to hash it out. So either having blinding or no blinding. I feel like both have different levels of transparency. So because of that, it is a little bit harder to recognize reviewers. I try to send notes, when time allows, that thank you, your review was really helpful. But I do think that's something we've talked about with our associate editors is, how do we show that, and how do we've talked a little bit about, maybe there's some things we can help with professional development, or getting, some learning experiences with the reviewers, and just letting them know that we are dependent on them, and we want to make sure they feel like they're supported as much as we can.
Yeah, and I would imagine, especially with a journal like PTJ that has, I mean, it's physical therapy focus, but physical therapy, as we know, is uh, pretty. There's a lot of breadth to the that, as opposed to
Right.
like an orthopedic journal or the manual therapy journal, where typically the submissions are easily alignable, and then you have a certain set of reviewers that there's some consistency in that understanding and knowing that you have everything from cardiopulmonary, pediatric, neuro, orthopedic submissions. I'm sure that's you have to have a quite a field of reviewers
Yeah,
reach out
definitely.
to.
And board members, and the you mentioned that the breadth, and that's part of the reason why they before my term added it's the Physical Therapy and Rehabilitation Journal, because wanted, I think,
Mm.
the rehab part to focus that. It's still the short is PTJ, and that's how I refer to it. And I think it'll always have that PT kind of focus. But I think part of the thought in adding rehabilitation was to make it more open, to other provider types. But you're right. I mean, we are a generalist journal, and I think that's one of the strengths of it. And figuring out how to play to those strengths is my job and the editorial jobs, and is to make sure that we are getting the type of work that that differentiates us from some of the specialty journals, because each has its role. And, the as you mentioned, the research universe is kind of expanding right now. There's a lot more out there, so there is, I think, a proper home for most articles, not all, but most articles, and finding that is really important. And for PTJ, I think it is making it clear that we're open to a lot of different patient populations, and content areas. But we where we see convergence is the rigor and the impact that are in that area is kind of where we try to focus in on.
Well, that actually goes into my next question a little bit here, and especially as you've evolved with. I always think of the '90s was kind of the introductory research. Whenever I read a paper from 1997, I'm like, oh wow, this would. And then you read
Right. Yeah.
early 2000s has evolved, and obviously it's evolving still. But what would you say is, as terms of what you've seen, what you're thinking about is going to happen in the future? What are the most significant sort of either trends or changes in academic publishing that you've seen and that you anticipate over the next few years?
Well, um, yeah, it's a good question, because I agree. One of the things I've talked about with some of the associate editors, is I think we're definitely out of that training phase where most of the work we get now is technically sound. So, and this is why, in ain't no plug like a self plug. One of the early editorials I wrote was how we're going to focus on impact, because I think the days of looking at a study and saying, oh, this is a fatal flaw, we don't want it, are kind of long gone. It's now more people have the methods under their belt, they're using validated measures, and more of a judgment of, well, what does this matter? How does this move the needle? That type of thing. And that's a tougher call for a peer review journal, because it does open up windows of maybe someone's bias, maybe someone's preference. But I do think that is one of the trends that we will have to embrace. And some of the major medical journals have already done this. It's not like this is breaking new ground, but I think it's just because our science, is now in a different age of maturation where we're seeing that. So I think that's one thing, is being at the front of the, like, why is this important, and much more than, well, it's important because no one's done it yet. That's not really why it's important. And for PTJ, a lot of that is, how does this drive or inform our clinical practice? Why might this be important for patient outcomes? Things like that. Is this a new care model that we're really interested in? One trend I hope happens, this is my own personal, and please don't take this to the wrong way, is I hope that we have hit our upper limit for systematic reviews. I feel like systematic reviews now routinely come to us with uninspiring clinical questions that have a literature search with 4 articles, but it's done right. They're doing the quality assessment, they're doing the risk of bias. It is done well, but there is a bit of a, well, systematic reviews at this stage in the game should say more than we need more research in this area. So I think, I think having, and this obviously links back to the impact part of it. But just because you can do a systematic review maybe doesn't mean you should do and I know they're great training vehicles. I know a lot of programs, for use them as a way for people to identify gaps in the literature and all of that. But I hope it's a trend where we become more judicious of those, or at least do some that are really informative and are related to clinical questions that matter, and that may mean fewer of them.
Yeah, no, I can't agree with you more on that. And I'm somebody that likes to do systematic reviews, but it does get frustrating when I see we're doing a overview of reviews for just the last 8 years since the neck pain guidelines were published, and we identified 56 systematic reviews on manual therapy and neck pain that have been published since that time. None of them really addressing anything terribly unique with
Right.
each other, and ultimately pulling from the same original research with just a little bit of a different
Yeah.
slant. So I think that is always a
And
troubling thing.
in a similar universe, probably 10, 15, maybe 20 years earlier now, I was, when manual therapy clinical trials were just first starting, there were more systematic reviews than clinical trials. So that when that ratio gets flipped, that's challenging. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I think there are other obvious things like, what is the role of artificial intelligence, in helping authors. That's a real important area in moving forward. So, we could go on, but I think the bottom line is that I'm looking forward to, helping PTJ figure this out so that we handle it in a way that is, that meets the goals of the members and the association and keeps us, positioned in a way where people view us as a trustworthy source of information. We haven't had a ton of, true misinformation yet in our field. So,
Mm.
that's another thing I'm kind of anticipating is, where will that likely occur, and what is the role of the journal in that? We haven't had, when I look at Retraction Watch, they don't seem to hit on rehab studies all that much. I don't know if that means they're just not there or they're not high profile enough, but that's the other thing I am kind of curious about is where is the misinformation cloud, going to show up in rehab?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I was actually going to ask you some questions about AI, but I don't want to. I know we could probably go on and on and on about a lot of things, but I wanted to go back to something that you'd mentioned. Impact obviously is a big thing for journals, and there's a lot that goes into impact. One of the things that you'd mentioned though was the clinical relevance and the clinical impact of things, and you always hear about. I don't know. It depends on which study you look at, but it's like, is it 7 years? Is it 10 years? Is it 17 years for, research to get translated into clinical practice? And I tend to be a little bit more of an optimist in this realm now because I feel like we have different engines for disseminating information. Now that could be information that is misinformation from science and such too. But, I'm curious as to what your thoughts are, and especially within the world of PTJ, how can we amplify that? Your early career stuff, pain science, I feel like that was one of the areas in clinical practice that actually took research and adopted it relatively quickly. And I don't know if it was because there was a massive need because we recognize that as clinicians. But what are some thoughts and what are some mechanisms that you all have thought about in regards to speeding that process up, or
Yeah.
have you even thought about that?
Yeah. And, first I want to address, you didn't say it, but we're using impact in a broad term. When you talk about journals, people, sometimes view, I'm not talking just about the impact factor.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking more kind of like you said about broader impact. And I think, the challenge is, what is the journal's role? The journal's role in dissemination is clear. What you're talking about is more kind of what is the journal's role for implementing things. And I think
Mm-hmm.
there are some inherent limitations to what print can do to help people move things into practice. So what we, look for are, what are some successful models that could potentially be scaled to other health systems? What are lessons learned? Because, the little that I've done with implementation, I'm always kind of in awe of how specific some of the issues are that pop up that limit, whether something works or doesn't work in a given setting. So I think the journal's role is to think of dissemination primary, but also think of our ways are to convey models that have worked or models that didn't work. What were the lessons learned, and make it very clear that when we are talking about implementation and moving into practice, that um, this isn't as good as when you attempt it on your own, but at least it gives you some guidance. It's probably like, reading a tour book before you go to a foreign country. PTJ can have its recommendations, but still when you get there, you still have to find the restaurant, and do all those things. But the tour guide gives you, some places to start, some things to definitely avoid. So that's what I think of our role. I think otherwise, it underestimates the efforts it takes to really change clinical practice, and I don't want to disrespect that by suggesting if we publish a paper, everything will change. I mean, we know quite well that won't happen. But if we publish a paper and then I bump into someone at a meeting and they say, that we were thinking about this and we saw that and we updated our model with these outcome measures and we got much higher completion rate, that's what I think our role is.
Yeah, and I love I mean, you've been a part of clinical practice guidelines and such too, and I think that's a big home for that as well. Um, so I want to probably get close to ending this show, and my last question for you, not is a prediction of the game tomorrow, but is well, because I know what your answer is. But what would be like a takeaway that you want the listeners to gain from this conversation? I know our listeners, it's a hard question to actually probably answer because our listeners are very diverse in regards to where they are at in terms of research. But if you had a takeaway or two, what would that be?
I guess one is, if you see something in the journal you really like, let us know. Like it's not something that just is up there. We get information from author surveys, which I think are kind of a necessary, I won't say evil, but they're just a necessary exercise. But sometimes it's very, and I'm not just saying me, send an author a note, it is something that is meant to encourage some communication. It's not something that is just, up there and you're supposed to look at it and say, oh, this is the finished project. So I think if you see something you like, reach out to the author or, to if one of the editorial board members, if they write, a commentary or something, and yeah, you can reach out to me. There have been a few people that email me and say, I like seeing this, because it is your journal. I mean, I'm not saying I need you to tell me what to do, but some feedback, outside of kind of the formal feedback mechanisms can be surprisingly effective at times. And if it's something you don't like, that's fine too. Let me know. I feel there are a few people that I've said, these writing editorials is tricky because everything else I've written has been reviewed by people. And the editorial is kind of the first thing where, the first one I sent to Jan, she looked at it, did some copy edits, made some suggestions. She always had good suggestions, like, what did you mean here? And then next thing you know, it's going to be published. And that's a little scary because I've always had this kind of, well, I have to reply to reviewer one and reviewer two. And if I say something that is completely off base, chances are one of them are going to call me on
Yeah.
it. So, there's a few people I was like, well, if I write something editorial that you really like, let me know. But also if you really hate it, let me know too, because I'm used to it's this weird kind of mentality where I'm used to hearing a lot about what people don't like about what I write before I get it published. And then that makes it okay, I think, because then it's like, well, yeah, nothing is perfect, but I've already heard a bunch about how bad this is. So, what else could happen now that it's published? And with an editorial or some of the things, you don't get that kind of pre-priming of how bad this could be. So, I don't know if that's the classic take home that you want, but I think, encourage people not just to read. I want them to read. And if they're when they're done with this podcast, if there's a podcast that related to the journal, load that one up. But think of this as something that you can interact with. And if an author writes something that you like, send them a note and tell them you enjoyed seeing PTJ and why, and you might be surprised at the response that you get.
Oh, that's great advice. People like to hear not just criticism, but also a little bit of, it's a lot of work with research, a lot of work with what you're all doing.
Yeah. And when it's genuine and it's 2 sentences, it lands perfect,
Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome. Well, that's great. Well, Steve, I want to thank you for your time. I know that you're going to put your tweed jacket on here for the rest of the
That's
Friday
right.
afternoon, and your
The pipe store closes
pipe
at 2:30, so I gotta head. I gotta head.
make sure you collect all the papers on your route tomorrow morning with walking your dogs. I know it's a nice circular route. It should be about
That's right.
3 papers maybe total. So, but do appreciate your time. Thank you so much, and I hope everything goes well with the
Yeah, it's
journal.
great catching up. Thanks for having me, and maybe we'll do it again in a couple of years.
Sounds good.